In 1807, Britain abolished its slave trade. By 1833, slavery was illegal across most of the British Empire. For generations, this has been presented as a simple moral victory, a triumph of humanitarian principles over economic interests. But what if I told you that the story you've been taught is only half the truth? What if ending slavery wasn't just about morality, but money? What if the same nation that led abolition had previously perfected the very system it sought to destroy? Today we're diving into the complex, often uncomfortable truth about why Britain really abolished slavery, a story of economics, empire, and the hidden motivations behind one of history's most celebrated moral victories. Britain transported over 3 million enslaved Africans across the Atlantic, more than any other European nation. So how did the biggest slave trader become slavery's biggest opponent? Before we can understand why Britain abolished slavery, we need to understand just how deeply involved it was. Britain's involvement in the slave trade began in earnest during the 16th century and expanded dramatically over the following 2 centuries. By the 18th century, Britain had become the world's leading slave trading nation. Between 1640 and 1807, British ships transported approximately 3.1 million enslaved Africans to colonies in the Americas, representing about 40% of all people transported across the Atlantic during the slave trade period. Liverpool, Bristol, and London grew wealthy from this brutal commerce. By the late 18th century, Liverpool alone handled 40% of Europe's entire slave trade. The city's landscape still bears witness to this history, with streets named after prominent slave traders and buildings constructed with profits from human trafficking. But the economic impact went far beyond just the ports. Merchants amassed enormous fortunes through the buying and selling of human beings. The West Indian sugar plantations worked by enslaved people generated vast wealth that flowed back to Britain. Many British banks, insurance companies, and investment firms were founded on or expanded through capital generated from slavery. Lloyd's of London, for instance, insured slave ships and their human cargo. British factories produced goods that were traded for enslaved people in Africa, while also manufacturing items consumed on plantations or by enslaved people. And the demand for slave ships stimulated Britain's shipbuilding industry. Slavery wasn't just a colonial practice happening far away. It was woven into the very fabric of British society and economy. Wealthy plantation owners returned to Britain with fortunes made from slave labour, buying country estates, financing political careers, and integrating into the upper echelons of society. The consumption of slave-produced goods, particularly sugar, tobacco, and cotton, became commonplace in British households across all social classes. To justify this system, racist ideologies developed that portrayed Africans as inferior and therefore suitable for enslavement. These concepts infiltrated British literature, science, and popular culture, shaping attitudes that would persist long after slavery's abolition. With all the wealth generated and the racist systems put in place, why did Britain decide to abolish slavery? What if I told you that by the time Britain abolished slavery, it had already found something more profitable? By the early 19th century, Britain's West Indian sugar plantations were facing significant economic challenges that diminished their importance to the British economy. The once mighty sugar estates that had generated enormous wealth throughout the 18th century were entering a period of decline that would fundamentally alter their relationship with the mother country. West Indian sugar production had reached its peak efficiency and expansion limits by the late 18th century. The most fertile lands were already under cultivation, and as soil exhaustion set in, production costs began to rise. Simultaneously, Britain's Caribbean colonies faced increasing competition from other sugar-producing regions. French colonies like Saint-Domingue until the Haitian Revolution, Spanish Cuba, and Portuguese Brazil were all producing sugar more cheaply. Additionally, the development of sugar beet cultivation in Europe after 1800 created a new source of sugar that didn't rely on tropical plantations or slave labour at all. The abolition of the slave trade in 1807 dealt another blow to plantation economics. Without the ability to easily replace their workforce, plantation owners faced increased labour costs and declining productivity as the existing enslaved population aged and diminished. The brutal conditions on sugar plantations led to negative population growth among enslaved people, creating a labour crisis that couldn't be resolved without the continued importation of captive Africans. Financial troubles further undermined the plantation system. Many plantation owners were heavily indebted to British merchants and bankers. Years of hurricane damage, soil exhaustion, and fluctuating sugar prices left many plantations financially unstable and less profitable than they were before. A wave of bankruptcy swept through the planter class in the early 19th century, forcing many estates into the hands of absentee owners or creditors who had little direct investment in maintaining the slave system. As West Indian interests waned, other economic sectors were becoming increasingly important to Britain, shifting the centre of economic gravity away from colonial plantation agriculture. The Industrial Revolution transformed Britain's economy, with textile manufacturing, iron production, and coal mining becoming the new economic powerhouses. The dark satanic mills of Manchester and the foundries of Birmingham represented the future, while the sugar plantations of Jamaica increasingly seemed like relics of a passing era. By the 1830s, manufactured goods represented approximately 75% of British exports, compared to just 30% in the mid-18th century. The British East India Company's growing control over the Indian subcontinent provided new sources of raw materials and markets for British goods that didn't depend on the Atlantic slave system. Cotton from India supplied British textile mills, while India became a significant market for British manufactured items. As Britain's commercial and political influence in Asia expanded, the strategic importance of the West Indies correspondingly diminished. Domestically, rising wages among Britain's growing working class created a much bigger consumer market that reduced reliance on colonial trade. The emerging middle class, enriched by industrial enterprise rather than plantation slavery, developed different economic interests and moral sensibilities that made them receptive to abolitionist arguments. Britain's imperial focus was also shifting toward Africa, Australia, and the Pacific, where different economic models were emerging. These new frontiers offered opportunities for resource extraction, settler colonialism, and what was termed legitimate trade, commerce in commodities other than enslaved human beings. Figures like explorer Mungo Park and missionary David Livingstone promoted visions of African commerce that would replace the slave trade with trade in agricultural and mineral products, opening new markets for British manufacturers. The financial capital that had once flowed into the slave trade and plantation agriculture gradually found more profitable homes in Britain's industrialising economy. Banks that had financed the slave trade shifted their lending to industrial enterprises, railroads, and other modernising sectors. Barclays, Lloyds, and other financial institutions that had roots in the slave economy reinvented themselves as pillars of the new industrial order. Trading companies diversified their operations away from commodities produced by slaves to embrace the growing range of industrial goods and raw materials. Former slave trading ports like Liverpool and Bristol found new commercial opportunities in the emerging global trade in manufactured goods. Insurance companies like Lloyd's of London, which had insured slave ships, redirected their business toward maritime trade in manufactured goods, international shipping, and other emerging commercial needs. This redeployment of capital wasn't immediate or complete. Many investors maintained interests in both slavery and industrial ventures for decades, but the overall trend was clear. By the 1830s, slavery had become less central to Britain's economic future than it had been a century earlier. The late 18th and early 19th centuries witnessed the rise of classical economic theories that challenged the mercantilist system that had underpinned the slave trade. Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, offered a systematic critique of slavery on economic grounds. Smith argued that slave labour was inefficient compared to free labour because enslaved people lacked incentives to work productively.
The experience of all ages and nations, I believe, demonstrates that the work done by slaves, though it appears to cost only their maintenance, is, in the end, the dearest of any.
He wrote, suggesting that self-interest and the desire for advancement motivated free workers to be more productive than those compelled by force. The utilitarian philosophy, developed by Jeremy Bentham and later John Stuart Mill, provided another intellectual framework that undermined slavery. Their principle that policies should seek the greatest happiness for the greatest number offered a standard against which slavery clearly failed. Mill would later become an active opponent of colonial exploitation, arguing that slavery's immense suffering could never be justified by the profits it generated for a small planter class. David Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage, which suggested that nations would benefit most by focusing on what they could produce most efficiently and trading freely with others, further undermined arguments for protected colonial monopolies. Ricardo demonstrated that artificial trade restrictions and forced labour systems, like slavery, prevented optimal economic outcomes, harming overall prosperity, even as they enriched particular interests. These intellectual developments had specific implications for the slavery debate in Britain. Economists increasingly argued that paid labour was more efficient than slave labour because free workers had incentives to be productive and innovative. This argument gained credibility as Britain's Industrial Revolution demonstrated the productive power of free, if exploited, wage labour in factories and mines. Free market advocates portrayed slavery as a market distortion that prevented the natural functioning of labour and commodity markets. They argued that ending slavery would lead to more efficient economic outcomes by allowing labour to flow to its most productive uses and establishing appropriate price signals for agricultural goods. Consumer benefits became another argument in the free trade arsenal. Advocates highlighted how ending mercantile protections for slave-produced goods would lower prices for British consumers. Sugar, a staple of the British diet that had once been a luxury, could potentially become even more affordable if Britain opened its markets to sugar from all sources, rather than protecting West Indian production through preferential tariffs. Free trade theorists also suggested that abolishing slavery would improve capital allocation by allowing investment to flow to its most productive uses, rather than being artificially directed towards slave-based enterprises. Capital locked in the declining plantation economy could be freed for investment in more dynamic sectors of the economy. The economic transformation and ideological shifts didn't happen in isolation from moral arguments against slavery. Instead, they created a context in which moral objections to slavery could gain political traction. A new business ethic emerged that attempted to reconcile profit-seeking with moral principles. Success in business was increasingly portrayed as the result of individual virtue, discipline, and fair dealing, qualities supposedly at odds with the brutal exploitation of slavery. This allowed industrial capitalists to position themselves as morally superior to slave owners, even as they exploited factory workers under harsh conditions. While economic shifts created favourable conditions for abolition, they don't tell the whole story. The abolition movement itself represented something unprecedented, the first mass political campaign in modern history. The growing industrial middle class, whose wealth derived from manufacturing rather than plantation agriculture, became a significant force in the abolition movement. Their economic interests aligned with their moral objections to slavery. Figures like Josiah Wedgwood, the pottery manufacturer who produced the famous abolitionist medallion showing a kneeling slave with the words, "Am I not a man and a brother?" exemplified this fusion of commercial success with anti-slavery sentiment. Abolitionists effectively argued that Britain's economic future lay in free labour, free markets, and industrial innovation, not in the outdated slave plantation system. This allowed them to frame abolition as not only morally right, but economically patriotic. William Wilberforce and his allies could appeal to both conscience and self-interest when addressing Parliament, arguing that abolition would position Britain at the forefront of a new economic order. As the direct economic benefits of slavery diminished and the social costs increased, the cost-benefit calculation shifted in favour of abolition. The costs of maintaining the slave system, including suppressing slave rebellions, defending colonies against foreign powers, and sustaining preferential trade arrangements, began to outweigh the diminishing returns of plantation agriculture. Religious groups, particularly Quakers and evangelical Christians, were among the earliest and most persistent opponents of slavery. They framed slavery not just as an economic or political issue, but as a sin against God. The Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade, founded in 1787, pioneered modern campaign techniques, petitions, boycotts, public meetings, and powerful symbols like the Wedgwood medallion. Women, who couldn't vote or hold office, found in abolition a cause where they could exercise political influence. Women's abolition societies organised boycotts of slave-produced sugar and gathered hundreds of thousands of petition signatures. The abolition movement showed how public opinion could be mobilised to change government policy, creating a template for future social movements. But there was another crucial factor that often gets overlooked. The history books often forget the most important abolitionists of all, enslaved people themselves. No account of abolition is complete without acknowledging the resistance of enslaved people. Their rebellions, escapes, and everyday acts of defiance made slavery increasingly difficult and expensive to maintain. The Haitian Revolution, where enslaved people overthrew their French colonial masters and established an independent republic, sent shockwaves through slave-owning societies. British slave owners feared similar uprisings on their islands. Major slave rebellions occurred in Jamaica in 1760 and 1830. One required costly military interventions to suppress. The 1831 rebellion, led by Samuel Sharp, involved 60,000 enslaved people and destroyed millions of pounds worth of property. It happened just as the abolition debate was reaching its climax in Britain. In Britain, formerly enslaved people like Olaudah Equiano became powerful voices in the abolition movement, publishing accounts of the horrors of slavery that British readers couldn't ignore. As resistance intensified, the costs of maintaining slavery in terms of military expenditure, property damage, and political instability were becoming increasingly difficult to justify, especially as profits were already declining. When Britain abolished slavery, it didn't abandon empire, it reinvented it. And that reinvention began with a £20 million payoff. When Britain abolished slavery throughout its empire in 1833, it paid £20 million in compensation. Not to the enslaved people, but to the slave owners for their loss of property. This enormous sum, equivalent to billions in today's currency, represented about 40% of the government's annual budget. The debt from this payout was so large that British taxpayers only finished paying it off in 2015. This financial settlement effectively bought out a declining economic interest group while allowing Britain to remake its imperial identity. After the abolition of slavery, the Royal Navy's anti-slavery squadron, which patrolled the Atlantic to intercept slave ships, became a powerful symbol of Britain's new self-image. Between 1808 and 1860, this squadron captured around 1,600 slave ships and freed approximately 150,000 Africans. While these efforts were significant, they also served British imperial interests by asserting naval dominance and expanding influence in Africa. But Britain's economic imperialism continued in new forms. Slavery was replaced with other exploitative labour systems, particularly the transportation of indentured labourers from India to work on plantations in the Caribbean and elsewhere. In Africa, Britain promoted legitimate trade in commodities like palm oil and timber, as alternatives to the slave trade, while extending colonial control. After abolition, Britain rapidly reconstructed its national identity around the abolition movement, positioning itself as a moral leader on the world stage. The narrative of Britain as a benevolent force, bringing civilization and freedom to the world, became central to British imperial ideology. This selective memory largely erased Britain's central role in establishing and profiting from the slave trade in the first place. So why did Britain abolish slavery? The truth is there's no single answer. Economic shifts, religious conviction, political activism, enslaved people's resistance and imperial strategy all played crucial roles. The abolition of slavery represents both genuine moral progress and the complex ways that economic interests and ethical concerns intertwine. It shows how moral victories rarely happen in isolation from broader historical forces. Today, as Britain and other nations continue to reckon with the legacies of slavery and colonialism, understanding this complex history becomes even more important. Celebrating abolition should never mean forgetting Britain's central role in the slave trade itself, or the continued exploitation that followed emancipation. A fuller understanding of this history reminds us that moral progress is rarely straightforward, but it is possible, especially when economic and ethical considerations align. If you found this exploration of Britain's complex relationship with slavery and abolition illuminating, please hit that subscribe button for more deep dives into the hidden complexities of history. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts or questions. Thanks for watching, and remember, understanding our complex past is the first step toward building a more just future.